Raymond Tallis, The Mystery of Being Human, God, Freedom and the NHS. A splendid book, a great read. It made me think. And that's something I've been trying not to do over the last few years. What were your reasons? What was your thinking in putting this book together?
In many ways, the book came together of its own accord. It's, as you probably gather from the title, it brings together quite a few quite disparate preoccupations. There is my long-standing concern about, in relation to humanism, trying to develop a humanism that on the one hand sets aside supernatural beliefs, but on the other hand doesn't fall into the notion that we are somehow simply parts of nature, that we're merely organisms explained by Darwin or whatever. So trying to define what humanity is, and that's been a long-standing preoccupation of mine. And quite a few of the essays actually explore dimensions of that.
I felt the timing is perfect for this book. Now, I don't know whether I'd have said the same thing 10 years ago or 10 years from now, but really it does seem perfect timing, because in the words of Bob Dylan, everything is broken at the moment. And this sort of restarts the thinking. Philosophy is dead. Stephen Hawking said that, I believe. Mm-hmm. What's happened?
I don't think philosophy is dead. No. I mean, there are certain physicists who think that physics provides the metaphysical answers to the nature of time and the nature of space and the nature of causation. And in fact, many of them are just very bad philosophers. They're fantastic physicists, don't get me wrong. I mean, thank you, physics, for the increased life expectancy. Thank you, physics, for the increased fun expectancy and health expectancy and laptops and so on and so forth. Physics has delivered. Physics also is part of science, which is possibly our greatest collective achievement. Having said that, it doesn't address many of the problems that philosophers have been preoccupied with over the last 2,000 or more years in the Western philosophical tradition. So I'm sorry to say Stephen Hawking's is incorrect. Philosophy most certainly isn't dead, and the idea that philosophers are just people who haven't caught up with physics is deeply mistaken. And that's one of the things that I have been preoccupied with both in this book and many previous books.
Can we get back to basics? Because words are ever changing these days. If you're wicked, that's great. What is philosophy? What is a philosopher?
Yes. I mean, etymologically, it is a love of wisdom, but that's a pretty empty definition. I mean, we all think we love wisdom because we love our own ideas, and therefore we must love wisdom, and that's what we feel. That's what makes us feel that we're philosophers. I think philosophy is an attempt to wake up out of normal wakefulness, to be astonished by the things we take for granted. It is about untaking the taken for granted. So actually questioning what it is immediately around us. What is it being an embodied creature like Raymond Tallis? What is it being surrounded by objects? What are objects? What is their fundamental nature? How is it possible we can be aware of things around us? How can this object here, Raymond Tallis's body, be aware of that object there, a table? All of these things are generally not astonishing to most people most of the time. And philosophy is about cultivating the art of astonishment.
So is it a return to childlike thinking? Because before we reach school age, we're looking at the wonders of the world, climbing trees, doing things, and it comes very naturally to us. Is it a return to that before we get on the treadmill?
I guess it is a way trying to retain the childhood sense of the luminousness of things while being articulate as well, and also bringing to it all the experience that one has had as an adult. So it's more than just returning to childhood. It's going back to childhood while retaining all that you've acquired and gained since you left childhood and grew up and put away childish things. Yeah.
I spent the last week at home, working from home, and my only contact with the outside world was through the media, telly, radio, the odd paper. And at the end of the week, I found myself quite down. Today, I've come into Liverpool, and on the train, there's an old chap sat next to me, and we started talking about the war. It's quite uplifting. Walking across Liverpool, I had this lady come up to me and tell me, "You've got the most beautiful hair." When I
No
arrived,
one's ever said that to me for ages, for reasons that will be obvious. Yeah.
And then getting here, I had a cup of coffee and had a chat with the guy behind the counter. Today, everything is great. What is the reality? What is reality?
I think that's a really good question, because I share both of those views. The sense of, on the larger scale, lots of things going horribly wrong. That this world, for many people, is absolutely appalling, horrendous. That their life is largely suffering and destitution. At the same time, I share all the delight that you have in so-called ordinary things, which on close inspection, of course, are not at all ordinary. They only become ordinary through inattention. So I think there's actually a deep tension within us between both acknowledging that the world is a grave and serious and often very painful place for people, on the one hand, and on the other hand, acknowledging also that it is extraordinarily complex, rich, and there's much more to it than we accept in the hurry of everyday life. And in a way that's reflected in the book, because there are several essays which are philosophical essays in the traditional sense, but in the middle there's an outburst of rage at what is being done, has been done over the last 6 years, to the NHS in particular, and to the welfare state more generally. At the fact we live in an undeveloping country where manicured thugs are actually tearing apart all of those things being created since the Second World War. So one feels that kind of ambivalence. Sometimes I feel a bit like Dostoevsky, who said he loved the idea of humanity. It was just individual human beings who drove him crackers.
There are so many wonderful quotes in this book, and I'd like to throw the odd one at you. As machines get smarter, you get dumber. Fact?
I'm not too sure that's necessarily the case, but it gives a permission to be dumb, so that we can, as it were, outsource a lot of our intelligence to machines. So that that then should theoretically liberate us to do things that machines can't do. And by the way, machines will never become conscious. I've recently reviewed a book by Ray Kurzweil, who said in 2027 we will have conscious machines that are more intelligent than we are, and then all hell will break out. This is the so-called singularity, when the robots will take over. Stephen Hawking has expressed that anxiety. In my review of the book, I teased him and said, it's very annoying. You didn't say whether it's going to be October 2027, whether it's going to be in the morning or the afternoon, exactly which place. But we won't get intelligent machines in the sense that we are intelligent when we're intelligent. Yeah.
Let me take you back. It all began in Liverpool.
It began in Liverpool, absolutely.
You became a physician and clinical scientist rather than picking up a guitar. Any regrets?
Not at all. I mean, if I had picked up a guitar, I think there would have been a lot of regret within earshot of me.
You were of that generation, though.
I was of that generation. I can
world.
remember hearing "Love Me Do" and 1962, and thinking there was some special music coming along. Music is very, very important to me, but I can neither read it, nor write it, nor perform it. So I can enjoy music as a total innocent pleasure. I don't feel at all competitive to people who are brilliant musicians. Yeah.
What are your main memories of the Liverpool you grew up in as a boy?
I think I was a rather earnest, hard-working sort of child, and was a bit competitive, and it was expected that I would work very hard. So the Liverpool of my childhood was certainly quite a sort of hard-working, busy, earnest, timid sort of life. I certainly, when I became an adolescent, I was very aware of what was happening in Liverpool and felt we were at the centre of the universe. It was really where it was all happening. Eat your heart out, Elvis Presley. The epicentre of pop music has moved to where I live, down the road. I didn't live very far from Strawberry Fields. The Beatles tour would have taken in our house and so on. So it was a wonderful sense of being in a place where it was seriously happening. Yeah.
You write in the book that you became an atheist as a teenager.
Yes.
What were you before that, and what brought on the change?
Well, I went to, my first school was a convent. I went to La Sagesse Preparatory School for 2 years, so it was assumed that I would believe in God and we would recite
Catechism?
the creed. I beg your pardon?
The catechism? Did you have
the catechism? Absolutely, and I can remember the first 2 lines and the rest is all a blur. I think it was...
Who made you?
Who made me? God made me. Exactly, yeah. And and then I went to an Anglican school, and again, you sang along with the hymns and didn't sort of break ranks. But slowly but surely, I became aware that there didn't seem to be any basis for this. I have to say, for a long time, until I was about 12, I used to say half a dozen Hail Marys and 6 Our Fathers before I went to sleep, mainly as a sort of insurance policy, just to make sure that if it was true, then I'd done most of the right things.
You didn't become lapsed. You wouldn't describe that period from age 15 to now as being lapsed. There's not going to be a return?
No, not at all. It was definitely a wakening up out of and a drifting away from. At least I would see it as a wakening up out of. Of course, others might have a different view. I remember when I was at Oxford, someone saying to me, "Do you know, if you lose your belief now, you'll never get it back again." And I sort of thought, well, is that supposed to be a threat or a promise? And then he added, "And you know, the great unbeliever Voltaire, he died eating his own excrement." And the answer which I should have said at the time, which I regret, was, yes, because hospital food in those days wasn't very good, and he probably wouldn't have been eating his own excrement. But I still felt a certain amount of anxiety that I might get my comeuppance, that there might be a deathbed conversion for a few years afterwards. And then, basically, religious belief simply became unimaginable anyway. It would be like putting your short trousers back on again, or trying to return to a period of your life which you'd outgrown.
Did it cause conflict in your family?
Not at all. I mean, my father was Church of England, my mother was Catholic, so neither of them went to either church, although they were married in St Luke's Church. And my mother perhaps had some religious belief towards the end of her life, or recovered her religious belief, but generally we were a sort of effortlessly secular family. Yeah.
You went to Oxford?
I did.
Tell me about your time there. Was it a medical world that you were in, or were other areas opened up for you?
The medics were regarded as grey men, and it was largely men in those days, because we used to work bloody hard. We would attend lectures all day and then have a couple of hours working in the evening and so on and so forth. So it wasn't exactly Brideshead Revisited, my Oxford. It was very much quite a hard working. And it was a series of quite extraordinary experiences. I mean, I met my first corpse, at the age of 17, and in those days used to dissect dead bodies, so it was quite a series of quite worrying experiences, because in addition, you knew you were moving towards a job that had a lot of responsibility, ultimately for life and death. So there was that sense. Having said that, Oxford was a beautiful place. It was utterly dazzling. And I made some very good friends there, friends that have remained for the rest of my life. And some interesting friends. Aung San Suu Kyi was a friend, Suneta Bandanaike was a friend, and these are sort of people you would meet in Oxford, and perhaps you didn't appreciate how extraordinary it was then. And,
what sent you in the direction of geriatric medicine?
A real interest in neuroscience and neurological rehabilitation, and all my research till I became a consultant was in neurological disease. So I was very interested in stroke, Parkinson's disease, spinal damage, and new ways of reversing damage to the nervous system. There was huge hope in the 60s, 70s and 80s that we'd find a magic way of talking to the nervous system in a way that would help it to recover. So it was mainly because I wanted to be involved both in neurological rehabilitation, but also in general medicine. I still wanted to do my heart attacks and chest infections and all the other things, to have the broad spread. And geriatric medicine made that possible, although I was still able to focus very much on neurological disease of old age. Yeah.
Has our thinking evolved since Erasmus Darwin? Or are we still stuck in that same period? Does thinking evolve? Or does each generation just go through the same motions?
God, that's a really good question. And one way of rephrasing that question is to say, if you look at philosophy, we haven't solved any of the philosophical problems that Plato was worried over. And actually, I'm not too worried about that. I mean, clearly, if philosophy was a police force, its clear-up rate was so low, it'd be put into special measures. But it's, in a sense, philosophy and thinking more broadly is not about narrowly solving problems. That's very much what science does. Science solves problems. What philosophy does is to look at the very framework within which you encounter yourself, very framework within which problems arise, and actually makes it more visible. And it comes back to something I was saying a bit earlier, which is about untaking the taken for granted. That probably doesn't answer quite your question, which is, does thought progress in some ways? And I think there are areas of thought where there seriously is progression. For example, our scientific thought, we can make statements that have a much broader truth value, that have a much greater general application. So the answer to your question is yes and no, if you see what I mean.
I like that answer very much. The human condition and God. John Lennon once said, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. And then he repeated himself. The human condition, God, are the two bound together? Can we have one without the other? Why do we have to have God? Why have we created God?
I think that's what you quoted from John Lennon, I hadn't heard that before, is very, very impressively true. It seems to me that God is the most terrible and the most profound idea we've ever had. It's the only idea that answers to the tragedy of our condition, the tragedy that we're all transient, we'll all disappear. Whatever we achieve, it's all going to vanish. It's also an idea that addresses the mystery of our condition. It's, as it were, suggests that ultimately there might be somewhere where it can be made sense of, or someone who makes sense of it. The trouble with the idea of God is there's nothing corresponding to it. So it is a wonderful idea. It is, say, the most profound idea humanity has ever had, but also the most terrible. And in the book I offer a quote from Diderot, who gives the story of a man who was betrayed by all his friends, by his wife, by his business partners, and he flees into a cave in the woods, and he's rubbing his eyes and determined he's going to get his vengeance on humanity that's treated him so badly. Suddenly an idea occurs to him. It's the idea of God. And he starts shouting the word, God, God, God. And he's overheard by the rest of humanity. They say, what is this idea? They throw themselves down on the ground, they start worshipping the God. And then they say, well, hang on, what do you mean by God? And what do I mean by God? And sooner or later, they're at each other's throats, basically, essentially murdering each other. Thus is the enemy of humankind avenged, says Diderot. So that's a very good way of capturing how the idea of God, certainly profound, in a way is a terrible idea because it causes so much trouble. I mean, we're in the middle of a 21st century and we still have terrible confessional wars, Sunni versus Shia, Muslim versus Hindu, and so on and so forth. The idea of God has been a wonderful idea for inflaming tribal antipathies, for magnifying hatreds, for bringing people together to slaughter each other. But also it's been a wonderful idea for propagating doctrines of love and so on. So as a secular humanist, I'm happy to take things from the idea of God without believing for a moment there's anything corresponding to it. And actually there couldn't be anything corresponding to it. Because if you look at all the different ideas of God and you try and extract, as it were, the highest common factor or the lowest common multiple, you end up with some self-contradictory notions, like the idea of an entity God who is both infinite but also separate from his creation. And you can't be both infinite and bounded. That's a mathematical error. So the idea of God often boils down to something like a square circle or whatever, which, as a thinker, I find I can't give house room to, because if I allow square circles, then I may as well give up on logical thought.
And out of God comes humanity, or is it the other way around? Neither God's work nor a piece of nature. Humanity, neither God's work nor a piece of nature. What on earth is it in that case?
And that to me is one of the central ideas of the book and the things that preoccupied me, that, okay, we can set aside a supernatural account, that we were somehow handmade by God. Darwin's told us the human organism clearly was generated by processes that are very similar to those that generated chimpanzees and so on. So that's setting aside a supernatural idea of ourselves. On the other big mistake, though, and one that's preoccupied me much more than supernatural ideas, is naturalism. The idea that ultimately we're just pieces of nature. Ultimately we're just organisms. So you and I are just rather smart chimps. And one of the topics that I've spent many of my books talking about is the difference between us and the rest of the natural world. The huge difference that is between us and our nearest primate kin, chimpanzees. We're not just smart chimps. And you say, so what are we? And in order to answer that question, you say, well, look about you. Look at what's in front of your nose. And what are we? We are creatures who have institutions. We have history. We have science. We make many things explicit that are simply otherwise embedded in nature, and so on. We are creatures who are self-conscious to an extraordinary degree and have a sustained self-consciousness. I have a sense of Raymond Tallis as he was in 1973. I can feel responsible for the mistakes he made as a junior doctor. So that sense of temporal depth is also part of what it is to be a human being. All of that is invisible in chimps. Yeah.
One of many LOL moments in the book is the line on being thanked by a paper bag. Could you tell us more?
Please discuss. Yes, of course. Well, one of the things you notice once you've started noticing it, is how often you are addressed by inanimate objects. So the paper bag will say, "Thank you for your custom, please call again." The doormat will welcome you. You'll be welcomed by a village so long as you're a safe driver. The bottle of zero-calorie, whatever it is, will congratulate you on making a wise dietetic choice, and so on and so forth. So we are frequently, as it were, addressed by voices that have nothing attached to them. And that is something that comes from something quite profound in us. That is to say that we are able to inscribe information, inscribe speech acts outside of our own bodies. That we are creatures who are able to, who create a world which is separate from us individually, separate from us as bodies. This is the world of a community of minds to which we belong. A world that sort of gets on with itself to some extent. And this is another aspect really of how different we are from chimpanzees. Even our nearest primate kin. Yeah.
The human world is, as much as anything, a limitless space of multi-loculated possibility inflated by headwinds. Why don't we get politicians telling us this?
Yes. I mean, headwinds of speech, of course. It's a word I deliberately use to mock the idea of speech. And when you talk about politicians, I'm thinking when Peter Cook spoke of a politician that he was an absolute breath of hot air, deliberately taking the mickey. But why does our astonishment at our own nature not enter into our politics, not into the kind of collective respect we might show to each other? And I don't know, and I think this is a really serious part of the work that humanists have to do. A lot of humanists think, job done once you've disproved the existence of God, or you imagine you've proved that religion was overall a bad thing, or whatever. But actually there's a lot more work to be done, and part of that is to make ourselves visible, the kinds of creatures that we are. And perhaps there might out of that come a better politics. A more generous politics.
Are you hopeful?
I think one has a duty to hope. Certainly despair is easy, and often people are thought to be more profound because they despair, and hope is thought to be shallow. I actually feel that the right sort of hope, a chastened hope, a hope that's a bit more complex than the hopes of the Enlightenment figures in the first wave of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. That kind of hope is an obligation to a thinker who wants to make a difference to the world.
Does it all come down to mortality? Fear? Can we think beyond our own mortality?
It's very difficult to think beyond our own mortality. I mean, a lot of people are sick to death of Raymond Tallis, but I can't get enough of him. I want more and more of him. And it seems to me that for that reason, we cannot resist playing with the idea of some kind of posthumous extension of our lives. The trouble is, when you look at any possible option, then it's very difficult to get a grasp. And for example, supposing it was a resurrection of the flesh. Well, if you look at what happens to my flesh shortly after I've died, the job of resurrection, of bringing together the heap of ashes into this miracle called Raymond Tallis, would seem to require things happening that have nothing to do with the laws of nature of any sort. To reconstruct me out of the feces of worms would seem to also be quite a challenge. So for a lot of people, the idea of posthumous existence is not of resurrection of the flesh or continuing life after death in a fleshly form, but in some sort of discarnate form. The trouble is, discarnate life doesn't seem to have much going for it, because you don't have anything to do, you don't have a location in space or a location in time. You're up there with all sorts of other eternal entities, like the square root of -1. Now imagine having the square root of -1 as your next door neighbour. You know, if you nipped across to borrow some coffee, you wouldn't get much change. So it's very difficult to envisage an eternal life. So we need that as a consolation, but it's a consolation that we can't even envisage. And you need to envisage it before you can even hope for it.
But of course, in the beginning was the Word, and this will be here long after you've gone. So you will live on. Eternally? Well, for a while anyway. It's something, isn't it?
It is in a way, but if you think about death's dateless or indeed dataless night, living on for, say, 50 years, if one did, is no different from living on for 10 minutes.
No.
And think of Shakespeare. I mean, he's 400 years on, we've all been celebrating him. But you feel his posthumous existence is wasted on him. You know, posthumous existence is wasted on the dead. Excuse me, just like youth is wasted on the young. I was in Prague last week, and I was going past beautiful Karlovy University, which is a lovely square, and there's a statue there. And the statue is in the sunlight. And that statue was a posthumous representation of some wonderful individual. But she couldn't enjoy the sunlight. And it seemed to me a perfect metaphor of posthumous life is basically being a statue in the sunlight, having no sense of the sun that's impinging on you.
In that case, let's go right back to the start. Ape. Ape to human. What have we lost and what have we gained?
I mean, what have we gained is our ability to question things immediately and also systematically. We cultivate what Paul Valery called the active uncertainty of thought. And the great American philosopher Quinn said, man is the creature who invented doubt, and we cultivate doubts. So in that sense, that's something very fundamental about us, from which comes science, and from science comes technology. A couple of weeks ago, there was a huge hoo-ha because someone had discovered a small group of apes, I've forgotten which ones they were, who were using stones to crack open nuts. And everybody said, fantastic. Well, what were chimps doing 5 million years ago? They were using stones to crack open nuts. So their technological advances over 5 million years have been zero. And I guess in many ways that gives you some insight into the difference between us and chimps. We have a culture which grows and develops. Each generation builds on the previous generation. Not true in the case of chimps. We draw on an explicit shared history. We belong to a community of minds, which is greater than any individual one of our minds. All of these are ways in which we are different from chimps. But certainly our capacity to question things, to doubt things, is one of our most profound differences. Deliberately setting out to inquire. That's what the difference between us and even the brightest chimpanzees. And this is off the record, chimps basically are chumps.
Would the 15-year-old Raymond Tallis get on with his late 60s self?
They both have grounds for despising each other. The 15-year-old would despise the 60-year-old for being so fixed in his ways, very structured life, gets up in the morning, writes a few hours and so on and so forth. The 60-year-old despises the 15-year-old for the naivety of his thoughts. So basically, they've all got good grounds for, disliking each other. But I suspect, really, if they sat down together and had a pint, his an underage pint, mine an overage pint, we'd probably get on reasonably well. But it'd take a bit of getting used to each other.
Freedom. Are you a free man or a number? And was that what Brexit came down to? Were we looking for an escape? And I use the word "we" very lightly.
Absolutely. I'm a Remainer and spent a lot of time on the pavement trying to persuade people to remain. But political freedom must presuppose a freedom at a more basic level. That is to say, fundamental free will. If John Stuart Mill was very aware of this. He was one of the great founding fathers of the liberal tradition, the sense that people ought to, the role of government is not to direct people to do this or that or the other. It should create a framework within which people can express their freedom, so long as it doesn't harm others. But he was also anxious that if he believed what his father James Mill said, which essentially were material objects and our minds were just driven by process of association, we couldn't really be free. So he was very, very concerned about how can we have genuine free will, which is the necessary condition of us having any political freedom. The answer to that question is actually very complex indeed. Most people trying to argue for our freedom of the will have looked in the wrong place. They've looked at the possibility of randomness in physics, or the unpredictability of chaotic systems, and so on and so forth. For me, our freedom lies in two things. The fact is that we make our own conditions, or the very condition in which we act, explicit to ourselves. And secondly, we're able to be out of any moment that we're actually in. So at the moment, when I'm speaking, I'm aware of the words I'm producing, but I'm also aware where those words are going. And I'm aware where those words have come from. And I'm aware of the larger future, which is part of my ambition, and I'm aware of a larger past, which makes sense of all my words. And that larger future, larger past, tensed time, is the context in which our freedom is possible. And by the way, despite what some ethologists say, very few animals have anything comparable to the depth of our tensed time. Tensed time is the key to our freedom.
So we are brains, souls, cosmic slop. What are we exactly?
Well, I don't think we're any of those three things. I mean, to some extent, yes, I am my brain insofar as without a brain, I couldn't function. In other words, everything within my mind, from the simplest tingle to the most complexly constructed sense of self, depends on me having a brain. If you chop my head off, my IQ falls very much indeed. But that means the brain is a necessary condition of my being myself. It doesn't mean to say the brain is what I am. All that I learned from my medicine, looking after people with strokes and epilepsy and so on, reminded me again and again that in order to function, you need a brain in some kind of working order. But that doesn't mean to say that you are a brain in some kind of working order. The brain, if you like, is our entrance ticket to the collective drama that is human life. So we're not just brains. We're not slop, I don't think, because there's all sorts of slop around the world which doesn't have an even hint of self-awareness. And as for cosmic rays, that's just a form of energy which doesn't seem to me to have much in the way of intelligence or self-awareness. What exactly we are and how we came to be so different, what the place of human consciousness is in the cosmos, is a piece of work that's yet to be done. And we will not even start on that piece of work, it seems to me, so long as we either subscribe to supernaturalistic accounts of what we are, or to naturalistic accounts that say we're just pieces of nature. Yeah.
Over the last few years, you've entered the political world.
Yes.
I suspect that was not a natural area to enter.
No.
And all revolving around the NHS.
Yeah.
Well, that's what pulled you in, or what is left of the NHS. How did that come about, and how did you find it? How did you cope?
Yes. I mean, I used to be quite political when I was younger, and then medicine was completely all-engulfing. You know, I was a 104-hour week when I was a junior doctor, so it didn't leave much space for chanting in chorus in the street and things like that. When I retired, there was more time to behave badly, and I think it's an obligation. If anybody's going to behave badly, it should be old codgers like me, because I've got nothing to lose. The only thing, I've got no future, no job to protect, and so on. So there is a huge obligation of older people to be, as my friend Grimley Evans said, the grey guardians of all our freedoms.
The little boy in The Emperor's New Clothes shouting, "You're naked."
Exactly, exactly. And who can say that? Because he is outside of that sort of frame of reference. I've remained reasonably politically active, became very politically active when the coalition government formed, and they passed a bill whose aim was to sell off the NHS to the private sector. And although there'd been a bit of that under Tony Blair had at least invested huge quantities of money in the NHS, as a result of which in 2010 it was as successful as it has ever been. High levels of patient satisfaction, waiting lists for operations just shrinking. It was fantastic. But there is a strong strand in the Tory party that loathes the NHS, not because it doesn't work, but because they hate its values. They can't understand something that is about values rather than prices. So the rage they feel at the NHS is like Caliban catching sight of his image in the mirror. They just don't like it. And particularly for their children. You know, we don't have a situation where the first thing that happens when you fall ill, you encounter a bill before you encounter a doctor. That will happen soon if we don't stop it.
Could we go back to the start of the NHS? I mean, it came out of a pretty bankrupt Britain, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It came at a time when, it was an idea that came out of the post-war consensus.
Viewed as a necessity.
Viewed as a necessity, and the sense we'd all been in it together in the war. And that continued, that post-war settlement of the NHS and of the welfare state more generally. It was an act of collective generosity. And it's really been since the 1980s, as neoliberal economics has taken a greater and greater hold on the collective consciousness, that people have seen the NHS as something that really is at odds with the sort of Darwinism, the social Darwinism that neoliberal thinkers espouse. And basically they do not like it, they hate it.
It's certainly hated in America, the very view. So where Obamacare, which is the closest they've has come in, it has been loathed. It's
been loathed by all sorts of people, including people who would benefit from it. That's the deep irony. I mean, false consciousness is alive and kicking. When we were going around the streets defending the NHS, the place where we got most V signs and index fingers and so on and so forth were in places where people would benefit most from the NHS. Yeah.
Can you figure that out? I mean, is it just manipulation via lies?
I think it's partly manipulation via lies.
There's a man, Lord Howe, who pops up in your book.
Lord Howe, who had this wicked dream that the NHS would be torn apart. Yeah. But it also is something that's very common is you don't realise what something was until it's gone. I mean, I'm breathing the air at the moment, and I'm not aware of it. If you actually started sucking air out of the room, I'd suddenly realise, gosh, I'm losing something that I've taken for granted.
Yeah, and we were both born in a world that had the NHS already.
Yes,
it wasn't something we had to fight for.
Exactly. And what all comparisons show that a publicly funded NHS is actually not only a decent collective gesture; it's the most effective way of delivering healthcare. There was a study published in 2011 which found that our NHS was top in the world for quality of care, access, safety, and most important, value for money. We spend a very small proportion of our GDP on NHS compared with European countries, and yet we do extraordinarily well. But it's starting to fall apart in very serious ways, and the pace is quickening. Yeah.
1 minute ago, by my calculations, it was 1966. Now they tell me it's 2016. What's that all about? 50 years like that.
Yeah.
Time. Is it maths? Is it mental arithmetic? Certainly I feel the mental part of it playing on my mind. What is time all about? And you have 60 seconds.
I have 60 seconds, exactly.
Yes.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I've just finished what I hope will be my magnum opus, which is a large book on time called Of Time and Lamentation, Reflection on Transience, the transience you've just referred to. And first of all, it argues against the notion that time can be reduced to numbers. That, for example, little t, the figure you saw in physics, that is the essence of time. Time is something quite different. The closer you look at time, the more complex it is. If you look at the present tense, it's both inescapable and also it's elusive. You can't grasp hold of the moment, and yet you can't escape from the moment. All the fundamental questions about time haven't really been fully addressed. Is it time just a relationship between events? Or is time something that events are located in, like the raisins in a cake? What is the relationship between subjective time and objective time? I mean, you've just talked about 1966 suddenly becomes 2016. I feel the same thing. I felt I'd lost my 20s and 30s and 40s through sheer carelessness by looking the other way when it happened. So there are lots of very profound questions about time, which I do believe that philosophers are starting to get a grasp on. But there's much work to be done yet. Yeah.
I was going to say, is it bigger on the inside? I suspect it is.
It most certainly is. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Humanism, art, religion, connections between the three. Your take?
It seems to me a lot of people think that they've arrived at humanism once they've set aside religious belief. And I think the story is only then beginning. Because humanism is very much a work in progress. And by the way, so is humanity. Humanity is a work in progress. We're endlessly defining and redefining ourselves. And part of the job of the humanist is both to react to that and to recognize this evolving collectivity of minds called humanity, but also to try and, as it were, get some sense of what is the best way to live. How can we, in the 60, 70, 80, 90 years that are given to us, how can we live in a way that is most appropriate? And that's the kind of task that lies ahead for anyone who wants to claim to be a humanist. That was a very bad answer to a very good question.
Speaking of humanists, I think Charles Dickens could be described as one. And he wrote in 1843, "Beware this boy ignorance, for on his brow I see that writ which is doomed to all mankind." Something along those lines.
Yeah.
The education system today, are you aware of it in any way? Do you have any dealings with it? And does it encourage thought, or is it still the education system of our day? Come in, sit down, shut up and listen.
It certainly isn't sit down, shut up and listen. The sit up and beg approach to teaching seems to be gone a long way. Even in teaching medicine, which is the only area I really know anything about firsthand. But something that really does worry me, well, two things that worry me. One is the idea that children should no longer be exposed to that which is difficult. That anything that is difficult is regarded as a kind of abuse.
We're all winners.
We're all winners.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that basically the only time I've ever grown is struggling with something difficult. That's when I feel that I have arrived at some more complex place than the one I set out from. And the book itself has got passages which I hope people will find very difficult. Not because I want to make things unnecessarily difficult, but because some of the ideas are intrinsically difficult and partly unfamiliar. The other worry is the closing off of conversation and discourse. A friend of mine was invited to chair a meeting 2 weeks after the Charlie Hebdo massacre at a university. I won't mention the university. And he prepared and the meeting was on free speech. And he prepared his opening comments, and he was just about to start the meeting when up popped the Pro-Vice Chancellor and said, "Oh, I must remind everyone about the safe spaces policy we have in this university, which is that people shouldn't be upset or made anxious by anything that is said." So my friend then tore up his opening comments, threw them on the floor and walked out and left them to get on with it. And that's the kind of worry I have, the idea of closing off discourse, either because it's too difficult or because it causes anxiety. or because it might raise conflict. And I think we need conflict, we need difficulty, and we need anxiety if we're going to grow.
Well, the big fear now is terror. Where's that come from, and what kind of thinking allows us to be taken in by that? And why does the media seem to play along with that story?
Yeah. It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, if you look at America's obsession with terrorism, number of people have been killed by terrorists in America. It's far too many, of course, but it's a few thousand. Number of people have been killed by fellow Americans as a result of using guns runs into the hundreds of thousands. And it seems to me that people do not put things into context or proportion. But terrorism, I guess, does, or at least the anxiety about terrorism, does appeal to people's preoccupations, their prejudices. It strikes a chord in the way that the mass slaughter of Americans by other Americans due to their gun laws doesn't.
As communism did before it.
Absolutely. The McCarthyite fear of communism, etc., Reds under the bed and so on and so forth. Yeah, yes. Which is not to diminish the impact of terrible individual terrorist events. But against that, there is a background of continuous slaughter in the States of Americans by other Americans. Yeah.
So to sum up, is this it? Is there more? What's it all about?
I think that to me is the fundamental question of, is that it? I think that was Bob Geldof's autobiography, wasn't it? Is that it? Was the title. But it seems to me that as a humanist, I would be dishonest if I said that I was happy with the idea that in 10 years' time, that, or perhaps even sooner, that's the end of me, that nothing will remain of me. I still feel that the very fact we have the concept of eternity, the fact that we can stand outside of time and measure time, suggests that we may not be entirely creatures of time. So for me, the idea of eternity, or of some sort of continuation, remains slightly ajar, but it's not attached to any specific religious belief, nor to any conception of eternity.
What is next for Raymond Tallis?
It is the magnum opus, which is coming out in March. I think it was James Joyce who once said, the least he expects of his readers is they devote their lives to his works. And I'm afraid this book is extremely long. It's just under 1,000 pages long. It's called Of Time and Lamentation, Reflections on Transience. And it critiques the notion of time as it appears in physics. It then looks at time as we experience it, and then addresses some of the fundamental questions about the nature of time and the relationship between time and freedom. And all of that is for 30 quid.
Who do you see as your audience with both of these books?
I think there isn't a ready-made audience, I think, for books that hope to be original. Beethoven's late quartets, he didn't have any audience for them. He had to create his audience. So in my most vain moments, I think if I don't have an audience yet, I might ultimately have an audience for some of the more difficult parts of the books. But this book is my lottery ticket for the 23rd century. But even so, that little extra smidgen of immortality doesn't make much difference when you're dead. It's still the sunlight on a stone statue. You know.
Raymond Tallis, thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful book, which I enjoyed from the first word on. A delight. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Tim. It's been very enjoyable talking to you. Yeah. Thank you.